Hello and welcome back to the Seventh Day Ox. We have Nikolai trying to get enough water for the whole week so that he can have his Sabbath off. So let's start right in. We're on chapter 22. Let's see what happens. At the camp, they worked to unload the barrels from the cart, trying to avoid spilling any of the precious water. It was a simple routine, but Nikolai wanted to get on the road again. Unfortunately, as they began the process all over again, neither Maxim nor Oleg seemed in any hurry to move at a pace that suited Nikolai. By now, Nikolai was beginning to feel that he would rather work by himself than have Oleg along. In fact, he was sure of it, as the two of them filled the barrels for the second time and then turned old Maxim around for the trip back to camp. Nikolai began to form a plan. Why tie up the time of two men doing a job that could be done by one? The job was turning out to be much easier than Nikolai had anticipated. Old Maxim was doing most of the work anyway. Nikolai waited to speak his mind until after they had unloaded the 2 barrels of water at the kitchen. "I've been thinking," Nikolai ventured. "It's a long way out to the spring, and it seems a terrible waste of manpower to have us both walking all the way out there. You've taught me what I need to do, what I need to know, and now the rest is up to Maxim. Why don't you let me try a run by myself? If I have any trouble, I can let you know when I get back." Nikolai swiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and ran his hand through his hair. "Do you think that would work?" You're probably right," Oleg admitted as he stared at the empty water barrels they had just unloaded. He stole a glance at Nikolai. "You'll probably have no trouble." And so Nikolai began his new job solo, and he put his energy into it. As soon as he was out of earshot, he began to do his best to get Maxim to increase his speed. But old Maxim didn't appreciate being hurried along. A few times Nikolai tried whipping him up a bit with the goad, but after a few hundred meters of this, old Maxim slowed his pace down to almost a standstill. In the end, Nikolai realized once again the truth of what Oleg had said. Old Maxim just couldn't be made to run faster. He would walk when he wanted to, and he would stop when he wanted to. And short of beating the ox mercilessly, it wasn't going to change things any. They made several more trips out to the spring, but as the day wound down, so did Maxim's energy. Near the end, he was walking slower and slower. Now Nikolai was really frustrated, and if the whole thing hadn't been so pathetic, he might have laughed. To Nikolai, it was obvious that Maxim didn't care how many loads he could get in before dark. He was just an animal. But animal or not, in some ways it appears that Maxim was just another one of the prisoners. He was being forced to work against his will, harnessed to a cart every morning, and made to walk back and forth all day to the spring. That was the life of a prisoner in a prison camp, wasn't it? Work, work, work. Like machines, Nikolai and Maxim would spend each day working as though that was what they had been made to do. They might not like it, but they would do it anyway, because that was what everyone out here on the windswept steppes of Siberia did. But all of that was just rhetoric. At the end of each day, Nikolai needed to have more than his quota of 5 cartloads of water in camp. By the end of the week, he needed 10 extra barrels of water, and as he was going to have to go through more pain and alienation in the box. This was his one chance. This was his opportunity. The opportunity Nikolai had been longing for during the 2 years he had been cooped up in the wooden crate. So whether Maxim felt like moving fast or not, they needed to get that extra water in by Friday evening. If they had to haul water half the night, they were going to do it. Nikolai was going to prove to the warden that working hard and having a Sabbath day's rest was possible. He wanted Yuri to know it, and Oleg, and any other person in camp who witnessed his persistent loyalty to the Sabbath and his God. But by the time the shadows were long on the Siberian landscape, Nikolai knew it wasn't enough. He was going to have to work after dark. The sun was low in the sky as the 5th cartload rumbled into camp, and he knew that he needed at least one more load tonight if he was going to make a dent in the 10 extra barrels he needed by Friday night. When Nikolai had finished unloading the barrels, He turned the cart around quickly and headed out of camp for one more trip to the spring. But Maxim had other ideas. He pulled the cart off the road and toward the stables just 40 or 50 meters away. Not to be outdone, Nikolai pulled hard to the left to steer Maxim back onto the road. It was a battle of man against beast, brain against brute. Maxim wasn't used to going back out to the spring that time of night, but Nikolai knew that he had to have that extra load of water. Nikolai used the goad to persuade Maxim. "Can't you get it into your thick skull that I'm doing this for your own good?" Nikolai half shouted. "I'm just as tired as you are," he added with a stubborn resolution that surprised even himself. "But it doesn't matter. We're going to do this whether we like it or not." Nikolai felt bad yelling at Maxim like that. The old ox was tired. He had worked all day pulling that cart back and forth from the spring. They had already hauled 5 loads of water and walked what Nikolai figured was about 14 or 15 kilometers. And now they were going to walk maybe 3 more kilometers and put in another 2 or 3 hours of work. He wished that he could somehow convey the idea to Maxim that a day of rest for the man on Sabbath would be a day of rest for the ox. But he guessed that he would have to just leave that job up to God. Only the creator of man and beast truly knew how to do that. Chapter 23. The next morning, Nikolai was up before everyone. He was up before any of the prisoners had stirred, and before the warden or the guards. He was up before even the cook had begun to stoke the fires in the kitchen. But the sun was already peeking over the horizon, and Nikolai guessed it must be about 4 a.m. He was a little weary from the short night, and his legs were a bit stiff, but he flexed them again and again to limber them up. He couldn't afford to sleep in or slack off now. He needed to be up and going, out on the road to the spring, so that he could get enough water barrels hauled in by Friday. The sun wasn't up yet. It hadn't even begun to rise in the east as Nikolai threw on his clothes, grabbed a flask of water, and went to the stables to rouse old Maxim. Of course, the hour was earlier than Maxim was accustomed to, but Nikolai managed to get him on his feet and into his harness. The old ox eyed Nikolai warily, as if he were suspicious of the man's every move. And why shouldn't he be? This man was crazy, urging him to hurry all day long, pushing him to work all hours of the night, and now he was getting the ox up and out of the stable at an unearthly hour. Nikolai was in a hurry to get going. He didn't think he had time to eat a regular breakfast, but he did stop by the kitchen for a carry-out meal. The cook was up by now and gave him some bread and carrots to take with him. Nikolai knew he could stop by the kitchen later that morning for some hot borscht and Russian bread, but for now the cold food would have to do. The man and the ox headed west out of the camp and toward the spring. Maxim knew the way, even in the dark. He could walk the distance himself without anyone guiding him. He would have even been able to make the trip without Nikolai sleeping in the back, with Nikolai sleeping in the back of the ox cart. Unfortunately, there wasn't room in the cart. The barrels were too big and took up all the space. The morning was peaceful at this hour, with the silence of nature all around them. The only sound that broke the stillness of the morning was the creaking of old Maxim's harness and the squeaking wheels on the ox cart. Other than that, there was little to punctuate the early morning hour. In the pale light of pre-dawn, Nikolai could see a few lemmings coming out of the burrows they had made for themselves in the matted sedge grass lining the roadway. A little further along, he saw a snowy owl perched on a craggy rock, poking its way through the Siberian landscape. And of course, there were the snowshoe hares, now brown with their summer camouflage. At one point, Nikolai rounded a bend in the road and suddenly caught his breath. Sitting in the middle of the road was a large wolf, his lanky body tall and lean. Nikolai guessed he was about 3 feet tall at the shoulder, and he just sat there staring at the man and the ox. Maxim pulled to a stop with a few tense moments. It was obvious the ox didn't really know what to do. Nikolai sensed he was frightened because he could see the muscles ripple and tighten in the ox's neck and shoulders. Did Nikolai need to worry? Was this wolf out scouting for a meal? Would he come back with others from a wolf pack? The wolf finally got up and trotted off to the north. Nikolai breathed a little easier after the wolf left. No one had alerted him to the possibility of wolf attacks out here, and he and Oleg hadn't encountered the wolf the previous day. He consoled himself with the idea that the wolf was probably not a threat to anyone. There was plenty of lemmings and snowshoe hares for the wolf to eat. Of course, when the harsh winter struck Siberia come October, Nikolai was not sure where he and the ox would rank on the food chain for a hungry pack of wolves. Food was not exactly abundant for either man or beast in this deserted country. The only other sizable game on the steppes of Siberia would be the reindeer that traveled in scattered herds, or so he had been told when he asked Petya the cook during a conversation with him in the kitchen one evening. Chapter 24. It had been one of those days, months back, when Nikolai had just gotten out of the box and was trying to recuperate. He had managed to hobble to the kitchen late in the day to get something to eat. After the evening meal, he had stayed late and helped Petya scrub the pots and pans and prepare some sourdough for baking the next morning. They worked in silence until Petya began talking about cooking and the limited supply of ingredients he had in the camp. He was hoping for some reindeer meat that winter. The reindeer herds come this way some years. Other years we never see them, Petya had said as he covered the sourdough with a towel and set it aside. When they do come and we can shoot a few, we lay aside enough meat for a good long while. 15 or 20 reindeer is a lot of meat, but of course it doesn't go far with 300 men in camp. Petya glanced at Nikolai and raised his eyebrows. I suppose you're wondering where the guns are that they use to hunt the reindeer. Well, I hadn't thought of that, but now that you mention it, I guess I haven't seen any guns in camp. That's because they don't bring the guns out unless the reindeer herds come this way. I think they must keep the rifles locked up in the warden's office or something. No one really knows. I've never been told, he continued. Of course, they only give the rifles to the guards, but no one really gives it much thought. Everyone is just glad to get some meat to eat. Reindeer meat is pretty good eating. Petya began to hang the pots and pans up to dry, and Nikolai did what he could to help. If the reindeer don't come this way, then we have to satisfy ourselves with the cabbage, turnips, beets, and onions we grow in our garden. They keep pretty well, and in cold weather we can store them underground in beds of hay. Nikolai thought about the vegetables that Petya cooked up in the borscht, cabbage and beets mostly. Borscht was something every Russian ate every day. To not have borscht for a main meal was considered almost unthinkable. Petya had big forearms from his work in the kitchen. Making bread, cutting up turnips and beets, and scrubbing pots and pans could do that to you. He was a quiet man and didn't appear to have many friends, but he was a great cook. Everybody said so. You're a good cook, Petya, Nikolai found himself saying, especially with the limited resources you have to work with. You just say that because you don't know any better, Petya insisted, laughing good-naturedly, and Nikolai found himself laughing too. You've been locked up in that box too long. You're always hungry, and anything that hits your stomach tastes good to you, Petya added. Nikolai's reminiscing ended when he reached the spring. As he filled the water barrels, the sun finally rose in all its glory. He worked quickly to finish the job, and then turned Maxim and the ox cart around. It felt like they were making progress, and Maxim was responding well to the urgency Nikolai felt. At this pace, Nikolai was sure they would be able to bring home 6 loads of water, 12 barrels, and who knew? Maybe they would be able to do even more than that. In Nikolai's mind, 7 trips to the spring was not out of the question. All that morning, Nikolai drove the ox hard, never letting up the stick, never allowing the ox to rest or pause by the road for a little sedge grass. Today was Wednesday. If he could manage to get 14 barrels of water into the camp by bedtime, and another 14 on Thursday, he would only have to get 10 on Friday. That would give him time to get home and prepare properly for the Sabbath when it was time for the sun to set. But Nikolai was getting ahead of himself, and he had misjudged the nature of a beast of burden. As morning turned to afternoon and the sun turned west, old Maxim began to slow his pace. His shoulders sagged a little, and his tongue began to hang out when they stopped at the spring or at the camp to unload the full barrels. Of course, Nikolai let the ox have a good long drink while they were filling the barrels at the spring. That was efficiency at its best. Why not give Maxim a chance to rest and drink his fill while Nikolai was busy filling the barrels of water? When they were back at camp, Nikolai paused only long enough for Petya to hand him some bread and a tin full of red borscht. At these times, Nikolai never gave Maxim a chance to get more than a short drink. And so they plodded on, with Maxim growing more tired each hour and slower with each leg of each trip. By late afternoon, it was obvious that pushing Maxim hard had sapped the ox's stamina and his willingness to keep going. In fact, the 5th trip to the spring took more than 3 hours. The sun was so low in the sky now that Nikolai could see that they were going to be hard-pressed to get 6 loads of water. They would have to work long after dark again to do it. He was so frustrated with Maxim as the time slipped away, but what could he do? He determined that he would simply have to drive the ox harder. He had no other choice. They would have to go faster to get the water in by Sabbath. Nikolai had come too far in his plan to let it go now. With a stronger resolve, Nikolai vowed to make Maxim work, if it was the last thing he did on earth. But Nikolai knew that if this was going to really happen, something was going to have to change. He was going to have to reshape the way Maxim did things. To modify an animal's behavior, you have to force him to obey, either by punishing him for wrong behavior or by rewarding him for obedience. He cringed as he suddenly realized that this was exactly what the warden had been trying to do with him. The warden had been stubbornly putting him in the wooden crate, trying to break him. "Is that what I'm doing to you?" Nikolai asked incredulously as he stared at Maxim. "Is that what this is all about?" The lemmings along the roadside stopped their squeaking and sat up to hear more of the debate. The snowshoe hares browsing on the short sedge grasses perked up their ears to hear the final verdict. For a long moment, Nikolai gave the idea some thought. But then, just as suddenly, he snapped out of his reverie. "There's no time for that now," he argued, his mind seesawing back in the other direction. "I don't have time to be feeling sorry for an ox that doesn't want to work hard. If I can do it, then he can too." Nikolai didn't let up. "I'll push you all day, Maxim, and all night if I need to. I'll go without meals. I'll go without sleep." In frustration, he whacked Maxim on the rump with the goad, and the old ox jumped forward. Maxim was going to work hard all day, every day. Nikolai would see to that. Of course, at the end of the week, Maxim was going to get Sabbath off, just like Nikolai was. The pastor smiled in spite of his irritation. Any rest for Nikolai would be a rest for Maxim. The old ox didn't know it yet, but he would soon enough. Come Sabbath, he would be lying in the stable, enjoying the sedge grass, piled high in his feeding trough. All right, we're going to call it quits there. We'll start in on chapter 25 tomorrow, so join me then for more of the 7th Day Ox.